Day commemoration. I want to thank you so much for coming out on this wonderful day. When we take opportunity to take some time to honor those who have given the ultimate sacrifice for our country. Today we have some very special guests with us who always make it a point to come out to help us with this observance. I want to just give them some recognition. Crawford Cruz, American Legion Post 251. Lieutenant Vincent J. Russo, American Legion Post 382. Disabled American Veterans, Daughters of the American Revolution, Eagle Rock Chapter. Private Harvey, Post 2139, Veterans of Foreign Wars. Montclair Red Cross, and of course the Montclair Community Band. We will now be led, let's give them some round of applause, please. Also, too, if we have any veterans or those who serve the country in the audience, if you're able, just wave your hand or stand so we can recognize you as well. Thank you. We'll be led in our Pledge of Allegiance by Boy Scout Troop number 12.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remove your hats for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Troop 12. Let's give it a round of applause. We have some great Boy Scout troop and Girl Scout troops here in Montclair, and Troop 12 is always here to help us out with this commemoration. Thank you very much. Next, our national anthem by Passing Notes from Montclair High School. Thank you so much for passing notes. Next, Reverend Margot Walter, Associate Pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church, will give us the invocation.
I'm the only one you won't need to applaud at the conclusion of this invitation. So let's call on our God to be here and be over all that we're doing today. God of history, God of memory, God of community. watch over our time together today as we remember the people who have died so that we can remain a free nation that pursues liberty and justice for all. Even as we share this national identity, call us to a higher identity as your people, as humanity, made in your image and likeness, given responsibility for all of creation and for one another. Come, bless us here, now, and together, as we remember the sacrifices that enable our freedom and our flourishing. Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. Thank you. Before we bring up our speaker for the morning, I do want to recognize some of the folks who have decided to join us as well. From the council, we have Councilor Herlock, Councilor Slager. Well, feel free to give them applause if you choose. Councilor Spiller, Councilor Baskerville, Councilor McMahon, Councilor Russo, and from our public service, I should say our emergency responders, Chief Todd Conforti from the Montclair Police Department, Chief John Herman from the Montclair Fire Department, Deputy Chief Young and Deputy Chief Fasano from the Montclair Police Department. I see our Township Clerk, Linda Wannett, there outside. Thank you, Linda. Special thanks to Pat Breschka and her team for pulling this together every year. Thank you, Pat. Director of Community Services, Steve Wood. And I'll come back later with some other recognitions, but I also want to recognize two former mayors who I see out. I think I see. There's Jerry Freed out there. And who else is this? I'm sorry, Mayor. And Ed Remsen. I thought I saw her earlier. Good to see you. Our speaker for the morning is our township historian. As you know, we are celebrating our 150th anniversary this year, and part of that celebration is the refurbishment of this park. And I think you'll see around where the new plantings and new benches and new lighting. We're trying to bring this park up to a level that is fitting for our township. So I also want to thank our Public Works Department and our Engineering Department for pulling this all together. I want to give them a round of applause for the new Edgemont Park. Again, our speaker is Mr. Michael Farrelly. Michael is our township historian, and he's going to bring us some words on this occasion. Michael?
Thank you, everybody. At 6 o'clock in the morning, May 28, 1764, exactly 264 years ago today, a small band of about 40 Virginia militiamen and about a dozen Native Americans opened fire on a French scouting party asleep in a glen near what would later become Pittsburgh. Their leader, a young lieutenant colonel named George Washington, had debated with his officers about whether they should attack or not. Technically, France and England were not at war, but the French were building forts in the Ohio Valley. There was no doubt in young George's mind that they threatened his family and the way of life in his native colony. The battle was over in 15 minutes. Casualties were light. 1 Englishman and 10 Frenchmen had been killed, including their commander, Ensign Joseph de Jumonville. Although nobody knew it at the time, revenge for Jumonville's death sparked what became known as the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War here in America. Yes, George Washington started the French and Indian War. At 6:45 in the morning, exactly 100 years ago today, the 28th and 18th Regiments of the American 1st Division left their trenches to retake ground lost to the German army in France. America had sent about 300,000 troops to France in late 1917 and early 1918. The Germans knew that the United States planned to send hundreds of thousands more. They moved 50 divisions from the Russian front while Russia was negotiating a surrender. That brought their numbers up to 192 divisions and 3 brigades, far superior to the combined forces of England, France, Canada, and America. The German spring offensive that year was massive and brutal. The Allies, mostly England and France, sustained heavy losses. The commander of the 1st Division, General Robert Lee Bullard, had no doubt that they were fighting for their way of life against a German machine. They had to disable the German observation posts in the hills to cripple the ongoing artillery barrage. They attacked. The Americans stood up to several counterattacks during the next couple of days. It was a success. The Battle of Cantigny, as it was called, was the first major offensive undertaken by the United States in World War I. 49 years ago today, troops from the 29th Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division left the field after a grueling 10-day assault on the North Vietnamese command post An Song Ape Bia near Laos. It was also known as Hill 937 or Hamburger Hill. 72 Americans lost their lives. Once the North Vietnamese command post was dismantled, the hill had no further strategic advantage. Not everyone agrees that our way of life was at stake. Some feared that Vietnam was a domino in a vast communist plot to take over the world. The young men involved fought to save their fellow soldiers, the men standing next to each other. It is Memorial Day. We are gathered here to honor the brave men and women who have sacrificed everything to preserve our way of life. 2018 is the 150th anniversary of Montclair officially becoming an independent town in Essex County. I have been asked to touch upon our town's history. I see our history written on the names that adorn these monuments. I look at these names and I see the names of the families that made our town what it is. I look up and see the name Harold T. Crane, son of Frank and Mary Crane. The Crane family was among the families who created Newark in 1666. The family was one of the first English families to settle here on the mountain when young people started moving away from the old homesteads in Newark. The Cranes were the first to build houses here. Young Harold had just graduated from college and was working as an engineer in his father's firm when he was drafted and sent to France. He was killed in action in 1918. His body was sent back here and buried alongside his parents at Mount Hebron Cemetery. I see the name Harry T. Ackerman. There are not many records about Harry. Ackerman, however, is one of the names of the families that moved into the Dutch end of town in the early days. The house where the Ackermans lived still exists at 674 Grove Street. John and Gertrude Ackerman lived there in the 1840s. And John was the superintendent of the old wood-frame Mount Hebron School. That school was at the corner of Valley Road and Bellevue Avenue. The Cranes and other English families lived in the south end of town. The Ackermans and many Dutch families lived in the north end of town. They didn't often intermingle, but they coexist happily. The Dutch were mostly farmers. The English were farmers too, but a few industrious English businessmen built mills along Tunney's Brook. The dividing line between the Dutch and the English was Watchung Avenue. And Watchung Avenue is still the dividing line between Montclair and Upper Montclair. Montclair was part of Newark in the early days. In 1812, it became part of Bloomfield, named for General Joseph Bloomfield, a Revolutionary War hero, who became the 4th governor of New Jersey. The English and the Dutch lived in a section of Bloomfield known as West Bloomfield. In 1857, the first railroad started operating. It brought factory owners and their families into the area. They started to buy up the old farms and build country villas for themselves. One of the newcomers was the Adams family. Washington Adams lived on Park Street, then on Orange Road. His son, Washington Irving Lincoln Adams, moved into his father's house, then built a grand brick house called Irvingcroft on Llewellyn Avenue. Washington Irving Lincoln Adams took over a photographic equipment company from his father. He then became president of a publishing company. Like most of the newcomers, he volunteered for many things. In the early days, there were no full-time agencies. Everything was voluntary. The fire department, the police department. When World War I broke out, he did his patriotic duty and served as a financial officer in the Quartermaster Corps. His son, Briggs Adams, one of the names on the monument, also did his patriotic duty. He had just graduated from Harvard and was ready to follow his father into business when World War I broke out. He enlisted in the Army. He was killed in the vicious German offensive in March of 1918. Another businessman that came to Montclair was Samuel Crump. Samuel and Anna Crump came to Montclair in the late 1870s. He built a new factory for his label printing company on a street that became Label Street. Their son, Samuel Jr., enlisted in the Army when World War I broke out in 1914. He resigned his commission, but enlisted again when the United States entered the war. He became a lieutenant in the 27th Division. He made the supreme sacrifice on September 29, 1918, in France. The second railroad, that was proposed in 1866, caused friction between the people of West Bloomfield and Bloomfield. The citizens of Bloomfield were perfectly happy with the railroad they had. They weren't interested in a new line that ran through West Bloomfield. On April 15, 1868, the New Jersey State Legislature created an act that split West Bloomfield from Bloomfield, and the new town was known as Montclair. That was 150 years ago. The second railroad was a financial failure. But failure to earn a profit didn't stop the two railroads from bringing people in from everywhere. The Irish came to escape the famines of the 1830s and the 1840s. They settled in the area near Washington Street, which became known as Irish Town. They also settled in Frog Hollow. I look up and I see the name Joseph A. for Aloysius Sinnott. His parents, Joseph and Mary Sinnott, were born in Ireland. They lived a few blocks from Washington Street, then moved to North Fullerton, South Fullerton, that is. Their son, Joseph, went into the military early. He was in the Marines for 17 years. He served in Panama. When World War I broke out, he was promoted to lieutenant and sent to France. He was killed at Chateau Thierry on June of 1918. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The next group to arrive in Montclair were African Americans who were escaping Jim Crow laws in the South. Africans from Virginia and the Carolinas arrived in the 1890s and early 1900s as part of the first wave of the Great Migration. Julia Cruz brought her son, Crawford, here from North Carolina. When America became involved in the First World War, young Crawford enlisted in the New York National Guard and was sent overseas. At the time, African Americans could only serve in menial support jobs, and Crawford wanted to fight for the country he loved. He was allowed to fight with the French and took part in the major Meuse-Argonne offensive that crippled the German army. He was killed in the Marne on October 1st, 1918, shortly before the end of the war. His mother, Julia, made a pilgrimage to his grave in France, along with many other moms who visited their sons' graves in 1929. There is an American Legion post on Bloomfield Avenue named in his honor. Theodore and Bessie Coppage came up from North Carolina in the 1920s. Their nephew, Venius, and his wife, Gertrude, lived on North Fullerton. Venius worked in a laundry on Walnut Street. Venius enlisted in the Army during World War II. Lawrence Coppage, one of the names on these monuments, was a specialist 4th class in the Army when he was killed in Pleiku Province, Vietnam, in 1969. The next group to arrive in Montclair were the Swedes. I once asked a descendant of these Swedes why so many of them left Sweden and came to Montclair. I was told point blank that you can't farm rocks. There are several Swedish names on these monuments. There was a John A. Nyman, or Johann Adolf Nyman. He was killed in France on October 10th, 1918. His body was brought back to the United States. His funeral was at the St. Eric's Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church on Glenridge Avenue. The building's still there. Richard Lee Carlson's great-grandparents were born in Sweden. His grandparents came to Montclair around 1900. His father, Charles, married a descendant of one of the old Dutch families, Dorothy Van Giesen. Richard joined the Marines. Marine Corporal Richard Lee Carlson was killed in Quang Nam Province, Vietnam, in 1967. There were many fine builders among the Swedes. Many of the buildings standing in town today were built by Swedish contractors. Then the Italians came. They came to America to escape the wars of unification in Italy. They came to Montclair because there were jobs digging up the streets and laying sewer pipes. There are many Italian names on these monuments. I will mention a couple. Vito Maffucci was born in Italy. He arrived in Montclair in 1889. His wife Maria came several years later in 1896 with several children. They lived on Forest Street. Vincenzo Maffucci, one of the names on these monuments, came with his mom in 1896. Vito was a gardener. I suspect his son Vincenzo planned to follow in his father's footsteps, but World War I interfered with those plans. Private Vincenzo Maffucci was sent to France, where he was killed in 1918. Giovanni and Luisa Russo came to Montclair in 1906. They lived on Monroe Place. Giovanni was a mason. Many of the Italians who came were natural builders. Quite a few of their buildings still stand in the area around Mount Carmel Church and along Bloomfield Avenue. It was a matter of course that their son Vincent would become a bricklayer just like his dad. World War II came along. Vincent enlisted in the army and became a first lieutenant. He was killed trying to free his ancestral country from the grip of the Nazi Wehrmacht. He was killed in La Spezia, Italy on March 22nd, 1944. An American Legion Post 382 is named in his honor. So, this is the way Montclair evolved. It now welcomes peoples of all color and nationalities. It is known for its diversity. A lot of people ask me if that means, do we all get along and agree with each other all the time? Heck no. We rarely agree on anything. But we treat each other with respect. We work out our differences and we get things done. We have created a special place, forward-looking, but holding on to the good things from the past. I don't know how this works, but I never have to explain what Montclair is about to the people I meet. They just seem to know. I like to tell people that Montclair is close to New York. You can go into the city anytime, but you may never feel the need to go into the city. We have a lot right here. And I would like to thank the good Lord for all the courageous men and women who fought and died for our right to live in a special place like Montclair. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was really wonderful. It seems like we were feisty troublemakers in 1868, and we remain so 150 years later. A great history of our township. Thank you so much, Michael. I also want to recognize, I think I see our former councilman, Jerry Tobin, out there. Hi, Jerry. And also our Director of Communications, Kathy Wolf. Thank you, Kathy, for everything you do. We will now have the blessing of the wreaths again by Reverend Walter.
Well, as Michael has called our attention to the monument, I was noticing this saying that's not attributed, but it says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." And the only part of that saying I take exception with is the gendered language. So I would just say a man or a woman. But I think that as we come to honor people who have died so that we can live the way we do, it's a good moment for us to, the words are attributed to Jesus in the Christian scriptures, regardless of who you believe that person is or was, these are powerful words about sacrificial love. And I think that's what we're here today to honor. And these wreaths are a symbol of that. And so would you pray with me as we ask God to bless them? God of blessing, bless these circles crafted from your creation by human hands. Saturate these symbols with meaning. Let them stand for the sacrifice of many lives and the sorrow of many families. Let them stand for the terrible cost of freedom and our terrific responsibility to maintain it. Let them stand for our gratitude and our desire for unity. As we lay them here today, we ask for your wisdom and guidance to help us find pathways of peace so that we can practice war no more. Amen.
After Margot places the wreath, we'll have the firing of the salute by the Montclair Police Honor Guard. Honor Guard, we're ready. The benediction will be offered by Reverend Walter.
It's important to remember, it's important to then be sent out a little different than we came. Let's ask God for that. So God of history, God of memory, God of community, send us out with these symbols of sacrifice seared onto our memories. Send us out with hearts more open to one another. Send us out with hands that practice peace and love. Send us out with eyes that can see you as our source of help and hope and happiness. Bless us as we go so that we can become a blessing. Amen.
Again, thank you all so much for coming. Please take the opportunity today to thank a veteran and to make them aware of how much we appreciate and love them and are just grateful for their sacrifice. Have a great day. Thank you.